Welcome back to the live stream. This week we're going to talk about China. Is their economy collapsing, or am I just using a clever term for clickbait? Yan Liang joins us this week to break it all down. Be kind, stay safe, and enjoy the show. Yep. Welcome back to the live stream. It is December 9th, 2023. We are rolling up quick to the new year. We're going to talk about China today, and this is something I've wanted to cover for quite some time. We touch on it a lot, just doing comparisons. Obviously, China is an economic superpower now that rivals the United States, so it's impossible to kind of steer clear of China, but we've never done a deep dive. So we've got Yan on today just to explore the inner workings of the Chinese economy. We've got Dan back today, so we're going to bring him on very shortly. Mike's in the house. Steve's off for the week, so hopefully you guys stick around and continue listening. I know we all like to hear Steve swear, and rag on neoclassical economics, but sometimes he's got to take a week off. And that's important. Hello to everybody in the chat. Ghost on the half shell. Process server. I haven't seen you in a few months. Glad you're here. Matthias Sedin. We had a hockey player here in Vancouver. The Vancouver Canucks had Henrik and Daniel Sedin for many years. Very, very great players. So when I see that name, I think of those two great players, and they were known for cycling down low along the boards. Anybody that watches hockey, that means the two players, and these were twins, by the way, would go below the net often and cycle the puck back and forth between each other, and nobody could ever touch them. And then, of course, they'd put it in front of the net to one of their wingers. But this isn't a hockey show. It's an economic show, and I don't want to go off on that. So I'm going to bring on the man, Daniel Sanderson. Here he is.
How's it going?
Daniel, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing exceptionally well.
Good. You've been gone for a couple weeks. We missed you. We missed your insights. The show wasn't the same without you, Dan.
Thank you. Yeah, I had a family emergency, and I guess the easiest thing to do is just tell everybody what happened. Unfortunately, my mother passed away, and I had to be down there with her, along with all of my family. So that's what happened.
Oh, well, I'm definitely sorry for your loss. I'm glad you're among friends, at least for 2 hours. And of course, you'll be among family for the whole weekend, so that's even better. But you're with Ty. You're with your buddy Ty right now. So
that's right.
Life is sort of good.
Yeah.
Are you excited for the show today? China. We're going to be talking about China.
I am excited for it. I feel a little ill-equipped. I think listeners know that I advocate a little bit for Peter Zeihan, and Zeihan, I think, has been the popularizer of the China collapse theory or hypothesis. This is fundamental to almost all of his talking points. Is the superpower of China is on the way out. I think if I had more preparation, I don't know what Yan's perspective is on China, but I think I'll do a lot of listening and a lot of asking questions if good questions arise.
Yeah. No, and I agree too. I made a post last night just reminding everybody on Twitter that we were doing the show today, and I said I was going to learn a lot. And And then Yan, I think, put a message there saying, well, you won't learn anything from me. But I think I learn. That's how I learn, is from everybody
Yeah.
around me, right? So I'm going to learn a lot today. I'm definitely, my skill set on the Chinese culture in general is probably lacking, let alone the economic side of things. I'm sure I have a handle on the mechanical aspects, like the monetary aspects in a general sense, but culturally and economically, how that all comes together, I don't know. So I'm excited to find some things out, and I'm sure our audience is too. We've got Matthias Sedin. Here it is. He actually knows the Sedin twins. Let's bring up this comment here if I can. Here we. Oh, is that the right one? No, that's not. Sorry, Ghost. I'm gonna take you down. Where is it? Oh, now I can't find it. There we go. Here it is. The Sedin twins are from my hometown in Sweden. Okay, he knows all about the Sedin twins, right? Big fixtures here in Vancouver, Canada. Well, that's
Mm.
cool. Did you ever meet them, Tias? Did you ever actually meet the twins? And we'll find out. Let's bring on Mike. Maybe Mike knows the Sedin twins. He's from a hockey area, kind of part of the world. Here he is, Mike Radzicki.
Hey, Johns.
Hey, Mike.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the Stanley Cup when Boston played Vancouver, and I believe we won.
Right.
And I believe Brad Marchand had one of the Sedin twins behind the net, and he had his jersey with his glove and kept punching him in the face like this. And the twin just, that's my memory of that Stanley Cup. But
I was actually, I just watched about a week ago. I was watching a little mini YouTube documentary on that series, and that was a highlight in it. And just cringeworthy. We also have Burroughs biting the finger. Was it of Marchand? I can't remember, but he was biting a finger of one of the Boston. That was if you look back on it, that was a very unique Stanley Cup final where you had an elite skilled team in Vancouver those 2 years when they won the President's Trophy, which is the best record in the league during the regular season. They were second to none, but Boston had that grit that Vancouver just couldn't match in that series. And I think that just goes to show, it was in a slightly different era of hockey, but it just goes to show that grit still matters in the modern day. If you can affect, the other team's mentality in that manner, well, there you go. You got Boston winning the Stanley Cup and us rioting in the streets. So, Mike, how you been doing over the last week?
Pretty good. We're trying to wrap up some doctoral work here, get people graduated, get their doctoral dissertation defenses in line, and get the undergraduates squared away. My barn, they're finishing it 200 feet from me as we speak, and if all goes well, I'll start moving in later today or tomorrow. So I'm trying to beat the first snowfall, because it's hard to roll big machines down a slippery driveway with 6 inches of snow or something. So we got nice weather today, so I'm looking forward to that. And otherwise, the other Vancouver thing, we were talking before the show a little bit about Vancouver. My brush with Vancouver, I was there a bunch of times when we were doing a project that involved Premier Bill Bennett and his shepherding of the World's Fair in Vancouver. And we had built a system dynamics model of the escalation phenomenon. And that is colloquially known as good money chasing after bad. So, it could be on a personal level. You keep pouring money into a car that just keeps breaking down rather than buying a new car. Or at the Vietnam War, you send 1,000 troops to eradicate communism in Vietnam, and it's not working. What do? You send more troops. It's not working. What do? You send more troops. You escalate, right? So the question is, why do people do this, and how do you make it stop? And it was alleged in the management literature at the time that the Vancouver World's Fair was an example of that. So we contacted Premier Bennett, and he said, why don't you come to Vancouver? And he invited us up to his a spacious, luxurious apartment in some skyscraper in downtown Vancouver. Pictures of him and Princess Di on the wall and stuff. And he was very nice. And he told us his thinking about, how he viewed it and whatever. And so it was really very nice. So we went to Vancouver a bunch of times. Lovely city, really a spectacular place.
Hey, Mike, what was the takeaway of? I mean, that's kind of like a sunk cost fallacy. So what was the takeaway? And did he rationalize it? Did you educate him in any way, or how did that turn out?
This is some time ago, but at the time, the debate in the literature was, is it irrational behavior or is it rational with some sort of, there's a reason that makes sense that people are doing it, or is it cognitive fallacies like the sunk cost fallacy and the hero effect and whatever. And his argument was that it wasn't just about dollars coming in and dollars going out, Canadian dollars coming in, but rather it was about, pride, national pride, or providential pride, and this sort of thing. And so it was some stuff you couldn't put really a dollar amount on, and so forth. So I was like, well, that's from the horse's mouth. So it was very interesting. Then we started building some models, and we had some students build some models that were quite interesting. We got the ball rolling, and they did it for their senior thesis. And so it was really quite an interesting. In fact, now that I'm talking about it, I probably need to circle back and really remember what the heck we did and see if we can take another crack at it. Because I think it is an important sort of economic but psychological thing that goes on, and it's quite prevalent across areas of life. And we might take another crack at saying something about the phenomenon.
The World's Fair in Vancouver. You mean Expo 86? Was it 86?
Mm-hmm.
That would have been probably around that. I think I was teaching at Notre Dame at the time, and that was in the 80s. Yeah, so.
Holy shit, you're old, Mike. I was.
I know.
3 years old, Mike.
I was last point, because I don't want to dominate here, but I was at a restaurant really recently, sitting at the counter, and the waitress goes, "I'm getting so old, and I'm whatever, 26 years old." She was born in like 1996, and I go, and I was wearing a T-shirt from 1995. I said, "I got T-shirts older than you."
Yeah.
Dan, it's going to be your turn. It's been almost a month, so you're going to do the top chatters and commenters from last week. Here it is. Go ahead.
Okay, we've got Black Bulldog, Steve Fitt, Wayne McMillan, Alex Plant, Katie Cannon, Car Juan, Joseph Dibillo, Alex Marshall, Rodrigo Ribeiro, David Collins, Marks Orr, 847, Economics in One Lesson, Mike Newland, Dregai, Ghost on a Half Shell, TR, Botched Mandela, D. Bruce, Patrick Holtz, Web Freaks, The Libertarian, AJ, Tony Wilson, Algorithm, John Small, Thomas Darlington, Douglas Dowell, JD, The Hasty Ant, WWEFan0104, Ernesto Eduardo, Dub Barganas, Tomaz Serges, The Minstrel 55, Jack, Blue Bay, Castor on Pan, Matt. Okay, Matt Views, Regional 2000, M. Gibbons, IPTV, Paul Butala, Bob Leor, The Herald of Change, and Lost Adult. I almost lost it on that one, right? That Castor Pan. But,
So Marie told me 2 weeks ago, and I finally have it right. Tomaz's name is Tomaz Serde. That is the correct pronoun. And so we've all been getting it wrong for about over a year now at this point. So I have to correct you on that, just because I was corrected for about an hour straight. And Blue Bay, I think, gave a super chat last week, so donated money to Steve's cause. So thank you, Blue Bay, for joining in the show. I'm going to take that down, and we're going to bring on the guest, Yan Liang, Here she is on Stephen
Hello, everyone.
Prince. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing great. You are about to have a fun 2 hours with us. One, because we know nothing about China like we were describing. And two, this is not your average academic economic expo. It is a live stream, and a live stream of, shall I call it, fuckery. So hopefully you can handle us and our lowbrow comedy. Hopefully, anyways. First and foremost, I did the intro yesterday. I was really backed up against the wall doing all the intro stuff for each week's show. I did it pretty much yesterday and the day before. How do I pronounce your name? I pronounced it Yan Liang. Is that the correct pronunciation of your last name? Just so I'm right.
Yeah, it's very close. Yan Liang. Yeah, so it's very close. I mean, I've got much worse ones, but yeah, yours is fine. So
Okay.
Yan, I usually tell people it writes Y-A-N, but it pronounces Y-E-N, just like the Japanese currency. So it's a very appropriate name for an economist.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm glad I didn't butcher it too much.
No,
I
you're
should
good.
have. I should have got some like phonetic feedback from you before I did it, but I was so late.
No,
so
you're totally fine.
I'm just gonna wing it and see what happens. Well, now that we got that out of the way, who are you? How did you get into economics? What's your background, education-wise? Where'd you come from? And kind of put it all together in a summary for us.
Yeah, sure. So I study economics and it's actually in public finance and taxation as a track in economics degree in China, in the South China, in Guangdong province in Guangzhou, which is the third largest city in China, and in the Sun Yat-sen University, which is a rather pretty famous university. It's a good college. So studying there, I met Charles Whelan. So for some of you may know, or in the audience, he is an institutionalist, a Post Keynesian-Institutionalist. He's winning the Veblen Commons Award this year. So if you're going to an ASSA meeting, be sure to be there and listen to his speech. But anyway, so at that time, he came to my school as a Fulbright scholar. At that time, he was at Cornell as a labor economist. So he taught Minsky in Zhongshan University, where I was. So I just fell in love with the way he teaches and also the content itself. And so after that, I talked to him about I wanted to learn more. And so he encouraged me to come to the States to study at UMKC. That's where people can study Minsky, right? With Randall Wray, with Jan Kriegel at the time there, Matt Forstater, and many others. And so I didn't really make up my mind. So after I graduated, I worked in the China's customs for a year. It's a government job, very well paid, very relaxing job, but super boring. So I managed to stay there for a year and then I left. And so I went to UMKC in 2002. And I studied under Randall Wray, Jan Kriegel, Fred Lee. I was Fred Lee's teaching assistant, and then I was Randy's research assistant. I also worked for Stephanie Carlton in her money and banking class and international finance class as her teaching assistant. So after all of that, I graduated. I worked on the FDI in China. So that's my PhD dissertation. So it's really to explore international finance and macroeconomic impacts. So that's basically what I have done for quite a long time. And then I took a job at Bard's College at Simon's Rock for a year. And then I moved down to Redlands, University of Redlands, where they also had two great institutionalists at that time, Chris Nickel and Eisenberg. And then finally, I moved up to Willamette. This is Oregon. This is where I have been since 2009. So I took a job because I'm married to Eric Timoin. I think he was a recent guest to your program. So at that time, he was in Eric Timoin. Eric
Did we have Eric? Did we
some
have
people call
Eric
him
Des
Time
Moines
Moines,
on?
but
Do you guys remember that guy? I can't remember that guy.
Remember Eric? We had Linwood on too recently. Tauhid.
Oh,
he was also at the UMKC. Yes,
Oh.
yes. So
Oh.
yeah, so at that time he was at Fresno State. So California State College at University at Fresno, and I was in Redlands. So we were 3 hours apart, and so we took a job we took a job search together in 2009. So he moved to Lewis and Clark, and I moved to Willamette. So now we are able to live together. So that's the whole story. And so
Wow.
yeah, so my research is mostly on Post Keynesian-Institutionalism and MMT, and I focus on international finance and macro, and so with the focus on the Chinese economy. So I'm glad that Daniel, you talked about Peter Zeinheim, and I did hear some of the things that he said, and I think a lot of times people wanted to make those very exaggerated claims because that's what people wanted to hear. But I think it's great that we're here today, and it's great that you have a lot of questions about China and Chinese economy, and so I think that would be a great conversation. And the vibes have been great so far. It's one of the most, I think, warm and friendly kind of podcasts I've ever been to. So I look forward to the conversations.
So we've got Ghost on the half shell. Hyman Minsky was both. Steve really has an affinity for Hyman Minsky, so he named his software after Minsky. He also named his Godly tables after Win Godly. So Steve's all about giving a name to the legacy there. So yes, he's both. Hyman Minsky was famous for his financial instability hypothesis. Steve kind of built upon that, whereas Hyman looked at it from one cycle. Steve showed it in excessive cycles towards a breakdown. But yeah, that's one and the same. Now, in the title, I admittedly used a clickbait title for the show. Is the Chinese economy collapsing? I suspect, Yan, you're going to say something to the contrary, which is probably true. So tell me, is the Chinese economy collapsing, or is it business as usual in China in the context that they have the housing credit or property credit crisis going on? If it's a crisis, you might tell me it's wrong, and a few other things. So kind of just break down where the Chinese economy is today.
Yeah. Well, no one can predict the future, so no one knows if China's economy is going to collapse. But if you do want to hold that view, I would advise that you have to be very patient. Gordon Chang has written the book about, China's economy collapse back in 2000. So he predicted that China's economy, back in 2000, that it's going to collapse in 2011. And that was actually when China started to grow at a high speed, back in 2011. So, and he still keep talking about the China's collapse, right? So, so I would just say you have to be super patient, at least 20 more years in the waiting or more. And also, I think really depends on what you mean by collapse, right? So when you're saying that China's economy growth goes from over 10% a year to 4% or 3% a year, that is a definition of collapse, then maybe, right? Maybe that, no countries can maintain a double-digit growth for forever. So if you think that it's a collapse, then maybe, right? But I don't think collapse in the sense that, you have a drastic financial crisis, you have a plummet in GDP, you have huge increase in, unemployment rates and so on and so forth, right? So things like what people were saying that what happened in Japan, right? But in Japan back then, the housing market and the stock market collapsed, and it caused the loss to the tune of 230% of the GDP. China is nowhere close to that level. Even now, after 3 years of real estate sector adjustment, real estate sector is pretty sluggish at this point. But you're nowhere to see that level of loss in the sector. And I would say, with this great adjustments, it has been done in a pretty orderly I would say, manner, right? That the country still managed to grow by this year so far, 5.3% of growth rate, 5.2 actually. It's remarkable when you think about how many years it took to build up the real estate and how fast, right, and orderly that it has come down sort of gradually. It's still not done yet, right? It's going to continue to go. I think some estimates say we probably need 20 more months to digest all the existing, inventories of the housing before we can see some rebuilding and some, recovery. Others would say, there are probably more than 40 months of inventory to get rid of. So that still remains to be seen. But I think the worst has been passed in terms of the sentiment, in terms of how people price in, how far this real estate market is going to go down. So I don't buy the collapsing story, although I do think that China's growth is going to slow down, and how much that slowdown is going to be really depends on policies. So I think that we can talk about those. Yeah.
So it's safe to say, in summarizing all that, China obviously has at its 30 years of moving into some sort of capitalistic system, which obviously coming along with that is 10% per year GDP growth, and that we're probably moving into China having a middle class, normalizing its growth. They've come into their own, so we're not going to see 10% growth anymore. We might again, who knows? Like you said, we can't tell the future, but normalized growth is not by any means the definition of collapse. So that's kind of what I got from that. Dan, I know you're just itching up there in the top corner. What do you got?
Well, I think one of the ways to look at this is that we've got such an interconnected world economy that collapse could mean a couple things. We like to use words endogenous and exogenous. In terms of like, is it internal forced? Is it an internal force collapse, or is it like a geopolitical world issue? And if China is a part of they're part of the world economy, and if we look at we could spin the conversation to talk about climate or global conflicts, these types of exogenous effects outside of China are definitely something that could collapse economies around the world. But that's not specific to the question of whether or not it's China's own internal workings that are the cause of its own demise. And I think what Zihan likes to compare is the economies of India versus the economies of China. And if I was to offer a criticism, I think he's overreaching a little bit because he's not an economist. He's a geopolitical strategist. And I think that he too heavily relies on population numbers, right? So that there's if the percentage of workers or young aspects of the population that are required to basically fuel the labor force of the economy, if that evaporates, then it can't actually sustain itself under its own weight. Whereas he's saying India is primed for that. China has an inevitability of collapse based on the demographics of the population. What are your thoughts about, and how much do you weigh demographics into your research and into your projections?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I think that is right at the center of the debate right now, which is, is China's slowdown structural or is more transitory? So one of the views is that structural view is about the demographic, dividends that has been disappearing, right? Because China is aging and the fertility rate is low. And so, soon we're going to run out of the labor force. And so that's going to, cripple the economy. So there's some kernel of truth to that in the sense that, population aging and decline is a potential risk factor, right? That is sort of a headwind of the Chinese economy. But I think we don't want to overplay it. I mean, So let me break it down. I think there is the supply side problem and there's maybe the demand side challenge. And I actually think the demand side is more of a problem, but we can talk about it later. Let's start with the supply one in terms of labor force. So I think a lot of misconception is, China grow because of the cheap labor, the cheap skilled labor. But I think that, in some degree, it helped when you have these rural population that migrated to the city and start with the industrial production, and that helped to promote the industrial development and China's growth. But I don't think that at least in the past 10 years that has been the really driving force in China's growth. If you look at, for example, break it down to labor, capital, total factor productivity, and see each of those parts from the supply side, what contributes to China's economic growth. China's labor force actually peaked in 2011. That is when the working population peaked. But as you know, after 2011, China still grew at a very fast pace, up until very recently, right? Recently in 2020. So it's.
Hey, Yan, I have a question. I have a question about that. Was that primarily driven by the housing boom, the state-sponsored housing boom? I mean, because if we dig into that a little deeper, I've heard that the houses are like vast empty ghost towns of unoccupied homes. So building for the sake of building in order to just stimulate economic growth numbers, that's kind of a house of cards, is it not? If that's what we're referring to as the primary driver for economic stimulus.
Right. So I do think that the real estate is over leveraged and is over invested. And you're right, there are ghost towns. And so that's why you now at the point where you want to readjust the real estate sector. And again, I don't think in the past the kinds of overbuild is really an enormous problem, because at that point, the population is growing, urbanization is going on, people are upgrading their houses. So there's some structural underlying kind of demand for those housing. But you're right, when urbanization is slowed down, right? Unless you have policy changes, which I can talk about. And with, population start to decline, you don't necessarily need to continue to build housing anymore. So I think people tend to very quickly dismiss this whole idea of housing boom in the past, 10, 15 years. But let's not also forget the advantages of building these houses. China has the highest home ownership in the world, 90% home ownership, compared to the United States, 60-some%, right? European 60-some%. The average dwelling sort of square meters in China is 40 square meters, and that is on par with the advanced countries. So if you think housing is a basic right for people, I think it's important to acknowledge, to understand the merits of this kind of building and the construction. But the problem, of course, is when you have a very highly leveraged real estate sector, there are two problems. One is that you build and and also the Chinese housing market price is too high. So this kinds of adjustment actually help to bring down the housing prices and allow some of the people to be able to afford houses. So it's not all bad when it comes to the adjustments. The other thing is, I think the real estate sector is, the developers are very interesting. If you look at really how they operate, right? A lot of times these real estate sector, the developers, they're not just focusing on housing constructions. They actually, expand the businesses to all kinds of sectors. So Evergrande, for example, they own a soccer team. They own movie theaters, they own shopping malls, they own a bunch of other businesses that are not their core business. And so that is the problem where, it becomes too financialized. It's driven by their financial, profit, driven motives. And so they're not really doing well the businesses. A lot of times they sell their houses, build, and then they take the money and then they invest in something else instead of complete the housing projects. So I think that is the problem. Right. So there's a lot of nuances, I think, that goes into the real estate sector. But go back to the labor force question. I just want to quickly wrap up that labor force sort of debate. Right. So first of all, I think it's an over exaggeration to use the labor force to explain China's rise. And it's equally over exaggerated to use the population decline to explain China's slowdown. So there are other things I think that would compensate for the sort of the decline in the labor force. So first of all, this decline is projected to be 1% a year. It's not a huge cliff, right? That kind of free fall that you're gonna all of a sudden all these young people are gone. And by the way, as not forget that China's youth unemployment rate now is probably somewhere between 20-25%. So in other words, we can definitely utilize our labor resources better, right, to support that supply side needs. And on top of that, 43% of the Chinese labor force has a high school degree. And that means there's still huge room, right, to improve labor productivity for the existing labor force. So if we're able to, provide more better education and boost labor productivity, which by the way, China's labor productivity is about 20% of the US's. So there's a huge room for labor productivity to grow to offset that, quantitative decline in the labor force. Also, let's not forget, the people who are retiring now have an average school of 7 years, but the people who are entering the labor force now have a school education on average of 12 years. So 5 years more of education. So that means their productivity is going to grow. And then last but not least, there's still 25% of the population, the labor force is working at the agriculture sector, right? Compared to OECD, the US, we could at least divert these labor force to the urban industrial sector or in the village township or, some of these more of a industrial type of jobs. And all of this, I think, will be able to compensate for, the lack of labor supply. Not to mention, finally, China is really leading or in some areas in the AI sort of revolution. So I think very soon we're going to start to, scratch our heads and say, where do we create jobs for these young people? The jobs are being replaced by AI. In China, the number is, 1 in 5 jobs will be taken over by AI by the mid-century or the end of the century. I can't remember exactly the timeline. But so there's a lot to talk about in terms of the supply side when it comes to labor force, right? Not to mention, at the end of the day, China can also gradually lift the retirement ages if really need to be, right? I mean, my dad retired when he was 65, which is the official retirement age. He's super healthy, he's super enthusiastic, he's super energetic, and he's super, he's running around to find jobs and volunteer opportunities to do. So I think, you could make it voluntary. If people want to work longer, they could, right? So all of these, I think, are from the supply side. But I think from the demand side, I think that's more of like, the young people are the ones that spend more. So the old people have different type of demand. And so we need to think about ways to accommodate that. And when it comes to economics research, I personally did not factor in the demographic sort of variables in my research, but there's plenty out there, and there's plenty of observations. Like Bulgaria, for example, they have population decline, still pretty fast growth. Nigeria has large population growth, fast population growth. Their GDP is not taking off like crazy, right? So I think there was a lot of these kinds of examples, and both in China specific scenarios, and also when you look around the world. I don't think that is going to be sort of that sets the Chinese the destiny, right? So I think there are many ways we could work around that. Yeah.
It moves to Ty's hypothesis of clickbaity, and it draws you in. So that's interesting. I did have a question. I wanted to bring Mike in, but Ty, did you want to?
Oh, I'm sorry. Just quickly. Sorry, one thing. I saw in the chat, Thomas. Thank you so much for that. Actually, in China, is working the retirement age for men is 60, for women is 55. I'm sorry for the confusion. I think I just didn't get the number quite right, but yeah, 60 and 55. So it's quite young.
Everybody, I'm kind of bookmarking and pinning any questions that I'm seeing in the chat as we go along, so I'll try to get to them towards the end of the show. We've got about 50 people watching on YouTube and 40 on Twitter right now, so make sure you're hitting the like button on YouTube, subscribing to the Prof. Steve Keen YouTube channel. If you're on Twitter, now known as X, hit that like button and repost. Let's try to get as many viewers as possible. We are definitely the most popular post-Keynesian live stream on the internet because we're the only one. And in fact, there's not many live stream economic shows, so we're probably right up there. And, you know, unless Paul Krugman or Larry Summers or one of those other bozos starts a live stream, we're always going to be on top. So make sure you're doing all that social media stuff for us. And if you are on any other platforms, I guess Mastodon and Blue Sky, you can always put out a tweet or I guess a post on those platforms about the show. That always kind of helps us. It shows that we are pseudo popular. So make sure you're doing that. And thank you to everybody that does that already. Yesterday, I was looking at all of our chatters from over a year ago, and we have like a few. I just want to point out, like Ghost on the Half Shell, been here since the beginning. Botched Mandela, been here since the beginning. Thomas Serde, I've got your name right, buddy. I've got it right now. You've been here since the medium, definitely since, you know, the start of last year. So thank you. I just want to go Geopolitical. I've actually bookmarked a few questions. He's been here for a while. Who else do we got? Process servers in and out every couple months. We see him. Yeah, big list. I don't want to go through it too much. I do have one here, from Joe. So this is an interesting question. I don't know if you can add. Ty, can you please ask if she agrees with the former Bank of England governor that China has a better financial system because they own the banks, directs bank policy, and no household fallacy? I'm not sure if I completely understand that question, but can you elaborate a little bit on that yet?
The household fallacy part, I'm not exactly sure, but I think I would agree. I really think that the fact that, you know, these banks are set up and they, you know, listen to the government's directives, they finance, you know, industrial projects, infrastructure projects, you know, all the productive uses of bank finance. I do think that, you know, works great. The only thing, though, is I think some of these commercial banks are taking on, you know, pseudo sort of fiscal responsibilities. So it could, in some ways, I wouldn't want to use the word backfire, but I think, you know, when you set up these banking institutions, especially when you're using policy banks, I think that is definitely the right way to go, where some of the market, more of the sort of market-oriented financial services, you could left those jobs to the commercial banks, right? The commercial banks. But when it comes to, you know, the state directives, when it comes to large infrastructure investments or research for R&D or industrial capacity upgrades, or, you know, social programs, what have you, leave those to the policy banks. I think that would be great. I think that is one secret kind of recipes for China's success, is they're able to utilize the kind of public finance to be able to, you know, mobilize resources. Because I think a lot of times the confusion that people have about, you know, the Chinese debt, for example, is to say, well, China simply invests too much and they take on too much debt. Well, I think investing too much is really a very murky concept, right? What do you mean by too much? When you build a railway, when you build, you know, a dam, when you build a port, when you build these wind turbines and industrial, you know, solar park, it would take years for them to generate positive returns in economic sense, right? In terms of profits, it's very straitjacket measures, but that is not the purpose of public investment. So when you said, you know, the Chinese government is utilizing you know, the banks and put up all these investments and they're not generating returns, and so you create debt problems, then I think, for, you know, there are two very important questions here. One is, whose debt you're talking about? Are you talking about private debt? Are you talking about public debt? And then you're talking about low investment returns. What do you mean by low? And what is investment return in this case, right? When you have private investment, yes, you can use, you know, ROEs, ROAs. You can use those metrics to determine if these investments are profitable. But public investment is a completely different creature. You can't use this very narrow sense of private profit return to define if a public investment is productive or not. So I think it's really the key, that we should not just follow the kind of neoclassical prescriptions, right, of or definitions of what is being profitable and what kind of debt is it's good debt or bad debt for that matter, and what debt is so-called sustainable or not. But yeah, going back to the question, yes, I do think that the Chinese banking system is set up in such a good way to support its economic growth, and it's and now I'm working on projects on how China finances green investment, right? Because China it's accounting for half or 1/3 of the global green investment. So how does China even manage to do that? So I think all these state-owned banks and state-owned public financial institutions play a huge role in doing that. But at the same time, there are people asking, should we diversify China's financial system? My answer to that is yes, why not, right? If you are able to use different instruments, but really with the purpose of supporting the real purposes of the economy, right? Not for financial speculations, then yes, you can build more, say the green bonds or the transition finance scheme. If you really are able to serve the real purposes, then yes, right?
Interesting. I want to bring Mike into the conversation here, and Mike's always super polite, but I'm going to try and prime Mike to offer a criticism to Yan. Okay. The criticism is, I think, goes back to how Yan started to explain or answer my question about population dynamics and demographics. And she went into explaining about the supply and demand. So now we've got two post-Keynesian economists in the room, plus Ty backstage. And one of the things that I take away from Steve's work is to completely stay away from supply-demand curves. So Mike, can you articulate or clarify, I would say almost a criticism of anything supply and demand related to what Yan was saying, or is there a criticism in there at all about using the language of supply and demand in an explanation of economics?
So a couple of three things before I get into that. I was a research associate at the UMKC Center for Unemployment Price Stability in the early 2000s. I don't know if you remember me. I was out there for the post-Keynesian summer schools and stuff. And
I was going to mention that. Yes, absolutely. I remember you, and I always remember your very dynamic presentations, and I enjoyed it tremendously. I think I met you a couple times, actually. It's not just one or two times in the post-Keynesian summer schools and various conferences. And I was graduate students at that time. Yeah. So yeah, I totally remember you.
Okay, so because I remembered you, and I didn't know, because I wasn't there like all the time, so I didn't know. But so it's good. It's good to see you. One comment about Minsky that was raised. Steve, really likes Minsky stuff. And he builds Minsky models, and then he builds models with his software program called Minsky. But if you know Hyman Minsky's work, his dynamic models, Minsky's work was with discrete time. And Steve doesn't like discrete time. So there's a bit of irony there. Although I was once on a panel at the American Economics Association meetings with Hyman Minsky, and he presented his model. I presented my model, and John Sturman from MIT presented his model. And afterwards we chatted, and John and I both work in continuous time. And Professor Minsky was very gracious. And he told me, I was very young, he goes, "You keep going, kid, it looks good." So I don't think he had any issues with continuous time. Now, returning to Dan's question, okay, supply and demand. So we're economists, and I can't help myself, and Yan probably can't either. When you're presented with a problem, supply and demand comes to mind, right? That's kind of how you're taught to think about things. And it's a very useful reference point. Now, that doesn't mean you go into the whole neoclassical story about supply and demand, but the concepts in and of themselves are quite useful. And when I do dynamic modeling, I think of stocks and flows and feedback loops and limiting factors, but I also think about supply and demand. If you said model a university, some problem, I would think, well, on the supply side, what's that? Well, the faculty, the buildings, the administration, the library, whatever. And on the demand side, that's the undergrads, the grads, the parents, just a useful way of thinking about things. And I was wholly in agreement with Yen's analysis. I think demographics, certainly for long run dynamics of any system, are super, super important. In the case of China, now I'm not an expert in China. Yen's little pinky knows more about it than my whole knowledge base, but my very amateur understanding of the dynamics over there is that at one point China was worried about being able to feed itself. And so it started pursuing policies to reduce its population growth rate, including the one-child policy. So you ended up with lots of males, right, competing for a smaller a group of females. And at the same time, China was pursuing an exports strategy for economic growth. And so you had people coming off of the rural areas into the cities. A man was more desirable to the limited supply of females if he had a house. So houses and real estate became popular, more popular than normal, let's say. I believe the national governments changed the tax structure. So more revenues went to the national government than the local governments. So the local governments were like, what are we going to do here? So they started selling off land. And there wasn't, I don't think there were real estate taxes, if I remember. So it became a very popular investment. And what do you get? You have a perfect recipe for a real estate bubble, right? Any kind of asset bubble. But I mean, these are challenges that have to be dealt with. You've got a lot of high youth unemployment rate, as Yan correctly said. And, like in the US, we have some people quietly quitting. They go to work and they don't care, and they give you just enough effort to not be fired. They're not motivated. What do you do with it? So policy, it seems to me, is where you have to look. And now, do you look to the educational system? Do you look towards more traditional fiscal policy, monetary policy, AI? Who knows what AI? I mean, I don't know. In my opinion, it cries out for modeling because there are a lot of moving parts here. You're really looking at redesigning the airplane. The airplane, for a while, was flying pretty high and pretty fast. It's leveled off. Maybe it's starting to go down a little bit. I don't think it's going to crash like, saying there's no way the Chinese economy is going to be, shambles. But, it's growing less quickly. And you've got these demographic issues on the supply side, if you will. And what mixture of policies, what mixture of airplane redesigns is going to make the airplane fly a little better, fly a little higher, fly a little faster, and keep folks happy? Last point, I think the advantage that China has over, Western nations, but certainly the United States, is they're a more disciplined society than the United States. Try to get anybody in the US to do anything. Try to get my kids in class to put their cell phones down, let alone, human beings are the same worldwide. I'm not, but the Chinese culture is just a little more disciplined, more respectful for elder, the whole thing. And so they might be able to pull off, at least more quickly, system redesigns than maybe we would in the West, because we're just we're the Marlboro Man kind of thing, doing our own things. It's like herding cats in the US.
Yeah. And please comment. I was going to then take the conversation. My ears perked up when you said you'd done some assistant work with Melanie Kelton. And I will take it there, but please respond to if there's anything you want to say to what Mike was saying. Whoops, let's put you in there.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, anyone who comes out from UMKC has to love Minsky, right? Don't quote me, but otherwise get kicked out. I actually wrote a paper titled Minsky in Beijing. It was in one of the edited books, but it was about the shadow banking system, back in the 2010s. So anyway, yes, I always love, the sort of Minskyan work, and, you guys are great building stock flow consistent models. And I think it's super helpful. I just never got the chance to really work on that specific thing. But, if I'm able to carve out some time to do that, I'll definitely, pick your brain and help me to design my model and things like that. And I think that recently I read some of the very interesting using stock flow consistent modeling and to show, MMT when it comes to, what happened when you have floating exchange rate, fixed exchange rate, and so on and so forth. So I think that holds really great promise to really, derive really interesting implications. So for the comments, so first of all, I think I'm using supply and demand in very loose terms. I'm just using it to categorize the thoughts. It has nothing to do with the whole supply and demand, theory per se, right? I mean, one thing that I think I would definitely disagree with the neoclassical in terms of their supply and demand is they're becoming independent, right? Supply side and demand side, they function separately and they're not, interacting, except that you find that intersection. But I think in the post-Keynesian world, as we know from Paul Davidson, right, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, they're not separate, and you don't have that close, upward downward slopes. So that I think it's fair to say. So I need to be more careful with the choice of words. So instead of saying supply and demand, right, we could talk about we can look at how the labor force affected production side, but also the consumption side. Okay.
Wow.
So that's
cheers. That's like great. You offered your best criticism of your own comment. That's really good. Right. It was a very good learning opportunity.
I meant, right. Then in terms of other comments, yes, I think the housing boom is interesting because, as you know, China was a socialist economy until they still call it socialist market economy, but the housing was socialized, right? Is the work units that provide the housing. That's the case until the late 80s, and in the 90s they start to marketize the housing. So instead of the work would basically assign you a place to stay, now it becomes commodified. So housing are for sale. So that happens mostly in the mid 90s, and so that created some housing bubble by the end of the 1990s. So the government stepped in, cleaned it up, and then it started to rebuild itself. But then again, the most recent sort of bubble started in 2008, 2009, when the great financial crisis occurred, started in the US and then engulfed the rest of the world, and China was hit hard. And that's when the government started to say, okay, we need to have more stimulus. So at that point, they had about $500 billion, $486 billion of stimulus package. And so that diverts a lot of bank lending, bank finance to the real estate sector, to construction sector. So at that time, if you are a real estate developer, if you go to the banks and borrow, for housing constructions, you will be green lighted, right? You're gonna get as much cash as you need to build houses. So that is what started the whole, overbuild and that sort of episode. So I agree with, what Mike was saying, that housing boom is a way to drive economic growth, right, by propelling investments. But again, I wanted to emphasize there are advantages of doing that at some point in time, right? And there's some degree that this is actually helpful, by providing real housing, right? I mean, there's a distinction. I think that some people argue that, China stopped the real estate bubble when it bursts is going to create, a lot of financial stress and financial sort of problems. But the difference between the Chinese real estate market from the United States is you don't see these layers and layers of securitization, right? Houses are built and people actually, 80% of the real estate sector debt is owed to is the mortgage loans. And the
Sorry,
Chinese
I missed
mortgage,
that, Yan. I missed that, Yan.
So-
You don't see layers and layers of
securitization.
Oh, securitization.
So like you don't have the MBS, you don't have the CDOs, you don't have the CDS square, CDO square, that kinds of stuff. There's no layers and layers of leverage. There's no layers and layers of securitization. So what the real estate sector mostly owed to the households, because these households, they borrow mortgages, they buy the houses that are pre-built. So the real estate developers then take this money and then supposedly they're going to finish the apartments and deliver those houses to the households, right? And mortgage loans account for 80% of the real estate sector debt. And the Chinese households have very low default rates, about 0.5% historically in terms of historical average, right? So they don't typically walk away from their houses and default on their mortgages. So it's unlikely that you're going to see this huge, debt deflation kind of scenario that play out in the United States, right, when it comes to the great financial crisis. And it's not likely that this is going to happen. It's also unlike the Japanese situation where, the Japanese corporations, they leverage, on the land, right? But the Chinese corporations don't do that. So I think that goes back to this question is, yes, the real estate sector is undergoing a rather painful readjustment, but it's not likely that you're going to see this deflation, in the Minskyan sense, to play out in China. And then the last point about discipline, I think that is very interesting. I think the Chinese economic system is, I think, it's very, in my view, it functions really well because it combines very good, planning with some kind of market structure. But its political system, unfortunately, right, I think it's very much centralized power. It's very authoritarianism. And so, that discipline sometimes is partly explained by the culture, but also partly by very repressive political control. So I'm not sure that's something that the Chinese people should really be very happy about. And in fact, I think the Chinese young people are also, in the US, we say the great critic, right? But in China, we call them lying flat. So there are a lot of young people, they lie flat, right? Because, some people say this is actually a good phenomenon because that means they have more choices. They can decide if they want to work, the 9-6-6 schedule, right? In China, you work from 9 to 6, you work 6 days a week. That's the 9-6-6 schedule. So the question, there is the comment that, oh, this is good for the young people. They rather not to do this kind of jobs. They would rather, do live stream to make money, or they do the gig economy, right?
We are not making money. Just anybody out there have some ideas.
Right, you should take some tips from the Chinese live streamer, right? One of the person, his name is Jiaqi Li. So he's a male. He does live stream. He sells cosmetics. He sells all kinds of things.
Well, that's the problem.
No, but
we need to sell cosmetics. That's the key.
You gotta sell something.
Well,
right?
I'm not sure Ty can pull that off. But anyway, so he is the most revenue-making live streamer in China. He can sell billions of.
Yeah.
He can sell hundreds of thousands of dollars just one night. Check it out. His name Li Jiaqi. He's so famous in China. I mean, he's making so much money. But anyway, so that's a lying flat. So some of the young people, they have other ways to make money. They don't go for the formal jobs. But others are simply like, why do I need to work so hard? My income is not going to allow me to get a house. I'm not going to be able to have a good life. So why not just, get by? So, I mean, it happens in the US, it happens in China.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I just wanted to respond to something Yan had said about the banking system. First, a little story. Some years ago, I did a lot of work with one of the trustees for Worcester Polytech. And this person was an alum, and then he had started a die casting business. And he made for a long time all of the box cutters that Stanley Tools made in the U.S. or sold in the U.S. He made them.
Wow.
And business conditions changed, so he went over to China to see if he could get the knives made there. And he was known as Mr. Knife over there, he said. And he was brought to a Chinese factory. I don't remember what city it was in the story, but and he said, the manager just said, "Oh, Mr. Knife, please sit down." And he opened a drawer and he put down one of every box cutter thing that he made, that the trustee made, but they were exact copies. And at first he was like offended. Then he says, no, I'll sell these to you for whatever. And he beat him like 20 cents a unit or something. And our trustee was like, "Oh my God, that's that's great." And what happened then was, at some point, Stanley just started buying directly from that Chinese company, and they cut the trustee out, and his business went bankrupt. But he was saying to me, I couldn't figure out how the Chinese company could make it so much cheaper than I could. And then he did some investigation and he found out it was the banking system, that he had to pay for the US guy had to pay for all his own furnaces and stuff like that. And the Chinese system allowed that company to finance that stuff much more efficiently. And I don't know the details of how it happened, but it gave the Chinese company a distinct advantage. It was the exact same box cutters, right? But it gave them a big advantage with the capital, with the plant. So what I'm leading up to is, as Yan was kind of saying, that the Chinese banking system might have advantages over a Western style banking system. And if it does, not everything is perfect, but to the extent that there's a better way to run a banking system, to redesign the airplane, to redesign the banking system, we should look into that, and say, is there a better way to do things to benefit everybody, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think that I think that's a great story. There are so much to unpack in the story, but just when it comes to financing, I think you're totally right. I think the neoclassical is too focused on, how do we allocate resources, right? So we need to find that, equilibrium, right? Interest rates. And so for China or other countries, what you describe as a good financing scheme to them is financial repression, right? That you set the interest rate artificially low. And so you are basically, that's what Michael Petit was saying, that you are like disadvantage the households to subsidize the producers. So that is a story, from that neoclassical perspective, right? That you're making loans too cheap, you're making savings paid low, deposit rates. So you're using the households to subsidize the producers. But then the flip side, right? If we really hear the story, if really tell the story right, is that you have all these resources. How do you mobilize them, right? So you're making finance cheap. So then the entrepreneurs are able to mobilize the resources that would otherwise be left idle. So I think that is really the lesson to be learned from this is that we have all these resources, the real resources to be deployed. And how do you deploy them? How do you mobilize them? Is you need to have an effective banking system or any sort of financial system, however you do it, right? So then you'll be able to put these resources to work, allow investment to flourish, then you create jobs, you create income, and that income can be saved, right? So there's all these, I think, misguided or misleading causations. Many people think, it's because the Chinese people are thrift, so they save a bunch. And so that saving can be used to finance the investment. That completely gets the story backwards. It gets the causation backwards, right? You guys are all Post Keynesians, right? Rick Keynes, chapter 7, right? The meanings of saving and investment reconsidered, right? Page 87, 88 to 89. He talked very exactly that you could have a bank system to provide the financing, mobilize resources, create jobs, create income can be saved. And then you always get this investment saving equality. That's by definition, right? Equality. But then again, a lot of the people get that causation reversed. And then the other thing I think in terms of, why China is so competitive, I mean, that is in the box cutter story, that it's also now in the EV story. So a lot of the, argument is, the Chinese government is doing all these distorted policies and therefore they succeed. But I think it's not that simple, right? If simply that, government can give you free money, so to speak, and you can succeed, then every country can do the same thing. But I think it's a matter of how you use your public finance or use your money wisely, right? So, yes, in the past, China was able to copy because the technology level was low and they can do it cheaper. But even to do the cheaper part, it warrants some investigation. How can they do the cheap, right? So there's the argument about, cheap labor wages, well, be that as it may, but, wages have been growing, productivity has been growing. But there's also all these infrastructure, right? You now Apple is moving some of its production from China to India. Guess what? They found that the casting, the iPhone casing quality is so low. Only half of the products meet this quality standards. That is in February, the Financial Times reported that. And there's also the question about the infrastructure, right? The roads are not efficient enough to transport things. The railway system is over capacity and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of things that go into that success story, not to mention the scale effect. I think also it's important. So yeah, I think that's a wonderful story, and I think there's a lot that goes into it when you think about it. Yeah.
So this is the part of the show where I get you to read the top chatters and commenters from last week. So if I did butcher your name in a small way, as you said, just minimally, this is the part where I can feel a little bit better about myself, because these names are fucking hard to read sometimes, and that's why I get everybody else to do them. So we're going to do that. Yan is going to do top chatters, top commenters from last week. Go ahead.
Oh, wow. Okay. So Black Bulldog, Steve Fitz, One Macmillan, Alex Plant, Katie Cannon, Carl John, Joseph DiBella, Alex Marshall, Roger Ribeiro, David Collins, Max Orr 847, Economics in One Lesson, Mike Newland, Dragil, I have no idea how to pronounce that, Goes on the Half Shell, TR, Botched Mandela, D. Bruce, Patrick Holt, Web Freaks, The Libertarian, Ajay, Tony Wilson, Algorithm, John Small, Thomas Darlington, Douglas Donwell JD, The Hasty Ernst, WeFan0104, Ernesto Acordo Dobaran Guns. I'm sorry.
No, you're doing great.
You're doing great.
I'm going to start speaking Chinese if you allow me. Thursday. 55, Jack, Blue Hang, Cast Iron Pen, Matt Views, Benjiono 2000, Maggie Beans IPTV, Paul Butala, Bob, The Herald of Change, I'm sorry, Lost Adult. You should also have a timer. You have to check, which
a timer is great.
And the one
Yes.
slowest.
Yes.
Have some kind of punishment.
Yes, exactly, and you'll be shocked or something. You got some new time. You got something to work on for next week there.
So all the names you struggled with, I struggle with too. It took me a long time to know that it is Drag I. It should be a space between the G and the I. What else do we have? Yeah.
I can't.
Yeah. Okay.
And they're not real out so much. This I can't believe I butchered. This one. I'm saying caster on pan. I mean, what? Cast iron. Why did I? Oh man.
Just a quick story. When I was,
it kind of reflects what is in your mind.
Yeah.
When I was a quick story. When I was maybe a freshman in college, I returned home, and my brother and I shared a bedroom. So it was over winter break or something, and we had the twin beds. And so my brother is 7 years younger than me. So I was, let's say I was 18 or 19. So he's, what does that make him? 11 or something. 11. And he says to me, we're getting ready to go to sleep. And he goes, "What the heck is a Sunji book?" And I go, "What?" He goes, "Over there on the shelf, there's Sunji book. What is that?" I go, "I don't know what the hell you're talking about. What do you mean Sunji book?" I was just kidding. My brother, I'm 5'9". My brother's 6'5", 300. My brother's huge. And at the time, he's pretty big. And he starts getting irritated. "I'm telling you, there's a book on the shelf. It's called Sunji book. What is that?" So I get out of bed and I go over there. I mean, songbook? So that's a big, in our family, that's a big, remember the time but he's insisting, Sunji book. Yeah.
We have a question here from WWE fan 0104, Josh from Canada. Everybody, he's actually Josh, a Canadian. His question is, on the topic of policy, right? What does Yan see as the plan for their exchange rate? From what I understand, they manage it but what are the possibilities of a floating eventually? What are they factoring? Yan?
Yeah, great question. So it's sort of, now they call it managed flow. It's, it's kind of okay. So before 2015, they started the exchange rate reform back in 1994. So before, so it was a pretty much fixed exchange rate from 1994 to 2005, and it was pretty much anchored with the United States dollars, the U.S. dollars. And then 2015, they start to 2005, they start to reform. And instead of anchoring the US dollar, they now have basket currencies where there are 26 different currencies that are in this basket. And so they're going to, in a way, monitor the exchange rate changes, anchoring with this sort of basket of currencies. So they set some band. So you don't want the exchange rate to be exact at the level, but you don't want it to fluctuate, let's say, either up or down by 1%, give or take, in a day. So this is sort of a managed flow at that time. And then gradually they start to expand the band. So let's say if 1 year is only 1% up and down, now they can expand it to 3%. So if your exchange rate is over by appreciates by 3% or depreciates by 3%, from this basket value, that is still permissible, that it's allowed, that it's okay. So the government is not going to intervene in the sense that they're not going to, go to the markets and buy these, basket of currencies when your yuan is depreciating, right? So so this is how things are still to today. The government attempted to either to further float and further loosen the sort of the control on the exchange rates or monitoring the exchange rates back in 2015. Didn't go very well because in 2015, when the government announced that we're going to continue to decontrol the kind of exchange rates or lessen the management of the exchange rates, you see a huge capital outflow back in 2015-16. So the central bank was losing foreign exchange reserves rather rapidly. And so then once that happened, then the government stepped back and basically saying that we're not going to allow for just completely free float exchange rate just yet. So what they are factoring here is, of course, one thing is they don't want a currency to, either appreciate too much, which will hurt trade. They don't want it to the currency to devalue or depreciate too much, because that could, cause some disorderly capital flows in the capital account. So they kind of want the exchange rate to be stabilized. Now that sort of concern, it's weighed against some other benefits of floating exchange rates. For example, if you have a floating exchange rate, you have more so-called policy space, right? So you don't need to worry about when you set your interest rates if that causes your currency depreciates. For example, right now, the Chinese interest rate is still rather high. As the U.S. raising its rates, the Chinese central bank is hesitant to lower the interest rates because they don't want the currency to depreciate too much. The Chinese yuan already depreciated quite a bit. Right now is about 7.2, 7.3 Chinese yuan per dollar. And not long ago, it was 6.9 or 6.8 yuan per dollar. So they don't want to have the currency depreciate too much. If they have a completely floating exchange rate, right, then they don't need to worry about if the Fed is raising the rates, should we follow, or do we just simply lower the rates depending on the domestic economic situation. So if they do float the exchange rate, then they would afford themselves a bit more in terms of their sort of monetary autonomy in that sense. But there's also complications there. There are a lot of ways that the Chinese government or the central bank is able to dodge against the kinds of pressure to either raise the rates because other kinds of central banks are doing that, or lower the rates when other central banks are doing that. So there are ways they can really alleviate the kinds of pressures from externally. Okay, but that aside, the other big concern that they wanted to follow the exchange rate is they also wanted to gradually lift their capital controls for the RMB, the yuan, to be used more internationalized, to be more internationally. This is the whole RMB internationalization debate right now. So as I think Michael Hudson, for example, talked a lot about this in terms of the hegemon status of the dollars, and if the Chinese yuan or a basket of currencies from the BRICS are able to counterbalance that. So that is a whole different story. But one of the things is, yes, they wanted to gradually relax the control on the exchange rates and also on the capital account, so then the RMB can be more internationalized. But again, that is not the consensus within China. Scholars debate vehemently about should we do that or should we not. But I think the reality is that you can't completely let your exchange rate flow, because again, this is what some of the MMTers would call, this is kind of a peripheral currency, and it's really under the pressure of fluctuations or volatility if you don't have some kinds of management. But again, not all MMTers agree with that. There are people who simply say, well, all countries should just flow their currencies, so then they get their monetary sovereignty. But I think in specific circumstances, there are nuances to that.
Yeah, anything moving away from a norm, I think, deserves to be approached with caution. And I think that, what the Chinese government is doing is monitoring it in a way that it can self-correct any early signs of implosion or problems moving forward. I have a question about MMT. I'd like to differentiate between domestic and foreign spend. And we could arbitrarily take any country, but let's just take the United States, for example, and say, if the United States wanted to send a large sums of money to another country, and it had virtually no impact on US inflation. From an MMT standpoint, basically my question is, what is the issue with transferring money into another country's bank account from a world leader, right? So for example, the US transferring money to another country, maybe ones that are less well off. It doesn't even matter to the point of the question. The idea is that it's not affecting anything domestically in terms of inflation. Why would that be an issue about basically transferring money to other countries? How would you approach that, Yan?
Well, I would agree with you. I don't think there was any problems of, what I have in mind when you say this is the whole idea of climate finance, right? That the rich country pledged they are going to help developing countries for their just transition. So they are going to set up this climate funds. I think so far there are 3 different climate funds, damage reparation funds, and some other two other ones that I don't remember. But they always fall short of their pledge. They're always saying that we're going to spend $100 billion. We're going to put $100 billion in these funds. We're going to transfer these funds to developing countries so they can have all kinds of green projects to counter climate change. But they always fall short of doing that. I think they only had $84 billion out of $100 billion that they pledged, and out of the $84 billion, a lot of it's actually loans, and also by the private sector that are clearly for profits. So to your question, no, I don't see any problems with, let's say, the United States Federal Reserve simply credit other countries' balance sheets and say, now here is some free money, go ahead and build a wind turbine park or a solar panel park, and we don't produce those. You buy it from China. They have tons of them, sitting in their garage or inventory or warehouse. I don't see any problem of doing that, right? The question is why these advanced countries don't do that, especially the United States, right? When the dollar is so well sought after. Why can't they do that, right? Other than, I think, some of the political constraints that they put themselves into, right? The idea that, well, we're broke, we're having $34 trillion of federal debt. We're running, we're running too much in debt. But never mind if we need to give $100 billion to support Ukraine or Israel, we can do that. But coming up with the money to finance climate change in developing world, sorry, we don't have the money. I mean, that is, to your question, there's no financing constraint, but there's all these political constraints.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine the web of intricacy could actually surface pretty quickly, especially if there's political aspects of where the money is actually distributed, how the pockets of wealth may actually be protected or segregated. Does infrastructure actually happen? We live in a global economy. There's maybe a flood of outside contractors that come, to support that infrastructure development, which could then affect inflation in other countries. So I think it's intricate on a broad spectrum. I would say, and it's almost a humanitarian play. Like really, with the wealth and the knowledge that we have, why can't we work on sanitation, drinking water, things that basically MMT could really turn around pretty quickly from a funding standpoint, I would say, right?
Absolutely. I think you're totally right. I think you have to separate the question between if you have the financing for it or you have the real resources to do it, right? So yes, you can always write a check and say, take this $100 and, build something. The question is, do we have enough resources to be bought with that $100? And does that create inflation? I think that is the real question to tackle with, instead of saying, where do I get that $100? I don't think that is the problem. I think it's really, do you have the resources to really support your endeavor, whatever that is? Yeah.
Yeah. Yan has it 100% correct, and Dan does as well. The problem is that politicians, pundits, media, influential media people have the wrong mental models, and that leads them to wrong conclusions. It's a crying shame that we could solve some of these problems. The financing part, as Yan is saying, is not the problem. It's the real resources. Obviously, if the real resources aren't there, then you're just going to exacerbate inflation. But to the extent we have the resources and people are stuck on the wrong mental models, we don't fix some of these problems. And the reason is what Keynes told us about the fallacy of composition, because my mental model is often based on what I see around myself. I have to balance my budget at my house. My company has to balance its budget. My state has to balance its budget. So damn it, the federal government of the United States should balance its budget. And that's the wrong mental model. And it's even more confusing because even if we got everybody taught sort of the standard sort of US-centric modern monetary theory story, well, what about Germany? Well, they're a little different situation, right? So depending on the nation, Argentina, now we're dollarized, different story. And then you also get into the impossible trilemma, that Yan was kind of alluding to previously about you can pick two of the three. Do you want to have monetary sovereignty, set your interest rates? Do you want to let your exchange rate float or be fixed or at least in a band? And then do you want capital constraints, money going in or not? Pick two, right? Well, depending on the country's circumstance, they pick a different two than a different country. So I'm sympathetic to the notion that lots of people don't have good mental models because this is confusing stuff, right? But nevertheless, the problem is, to a large degree, they don't have the right mental models as to how the systems work.
So
Yeah.
we've got another question here. We'll try to keep it rolling along, and this kind of dovetails into Dan's question here. What's the impact of China holding so many reserves in the U.S.? I think it's currently second overall in U.S. government paper, and that's from Adrian Terry. Yan, your thoughts?
Yeah, so that does create a very interesting question, a problem for the Chinese government. Yes, you're right. They're the second largest holders of the US Treasuries after Japan. They really wanted to diversify out of this. I think they actually successfully reduced the holding of the US Treasuries. I think the peak was in 2012, $1.3 trillion. And then gradually they tried to diversify and reduce that. So now I think, if I remember correctly, the most recent number is around 800 billion-ish US Treasuries. But there are always the question, if they don't buy US Treasuries, what do they do with their dollar reserves? So there are definitely different things that they are doing. So one thing, some of the analysts say they're not buying the Treasuries, but they're still buying the agency securities, right? The US agencies is still government bonds, just not the Treasury securities. But they also using some of the dollar reserves they have to recapitalize in some of their policy banks. So then they're able to, lend in dollars or invest in dollars abroad. So that is another thing that they do. The difficulty, of course, is, when you have this much of the dollar assets, where do you diversify? How do you diversify it? Like what assets you'll be able to diversify into? So that becomes a problem of the central bankers. So they've been talking about it, especially when the U.S. raised the interest rate and the Fed raised the interest rate, and that reduces the long-term bonds value. And also after 2008 financial crises, a lot of the central bank governors start to really ask this question, right? That how much we can trust the dollar, how much we can trust the U.S.'s financial system. So they do want to diversify away from it. But it has been difficult for them to do. So one of the things, of course, is to recapitalize the policy banks and lend abroad so that they can have these BRI projects, Belt Initiative projects. So they also want to use the dollar, by the way, to buy some of the U.S. Tech firms. But that was banned, that was blocked by the U.S. government. So that becomes a very interesting question. Like, what do you do with all the dollars that you have, right? What kind of assets you can buy? They want to buy real assets, but sometimes it's not allowed. It's blocked by the U.S. government. They wanted to acquire, energy companies. They want to acquire semiconductor companies, but the U.S. government say no, you can't buy these, right? Very similar situation as in Japan, right? That they want to buy Rockefeller centers, that kind of thing. So I think it's interesting because there are always these people saying that, China is lending to the U.S. China is the biggest, second biggest creditor for the U.S. And so, when Chinese decide to dump the dollar assets, then the U.S. would be in trouble. Or if the Chinese don't buy the assets anymore, then the U.S. will have problem. Now that is completely misled. I think, we all understand that the U.S. government is a monopoly of the dollar. Like, if the U.S. government is able to create dollars, why do they need to borrow dollars? That makes no sense whatsoever. There's a very good, the documentary is called Fighting the Money. It's a documentary that, talks about MMT. I would highly recommend it. They actually interview some of these high-level, the U.S., I can't remember. This is a Council for Economic Advisors. And so they were asking him exactly that question. Like, if the U.S. government has the monopoly power over the dollars, why does he have to borrow from China? And he has no answer to that question, right? Because it's not really borrowing. It's really that the Chinese have the dollar reserves from, their trade surpluses, from the investment inflows. And what do they do what do they do with the dollars? They can keep it in the U.S., as a deposits, but not any interest, or they can buy the U.S. treasuries and have some interest-bearing instruments. And the Chinese decide to do the latter. So that has nothing to do with the U.S. borrowing from China. And there's no interest also from the Chinese perspective to dump the assets, because then, they're going to suffer grave loss on the holdings that they have.
So we'll just keep rolling along. We got another question here from Bob Lior. I'm interested in hearing from Yan on the other ideas from UMKC beyond MMT that are worth sharing with the audience. Is there more stuff beyond MMT at UMKC? Yan, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think, in some ways, MMT is really grounded on all these different, heterodox approaches. I think this idea, institutionalism is big in at UMKC. James Sturgeon, who is really a long-term leading institutionalist. So this whole idea that money is an institution, that money is a public institution, that is something that is the most important funding institution of the capitalism system. So when you understand money, right, then you understand how capitalism functions. So I think that's also very important. And a lot of times we also, in UMKC, we also study, institutionalism, you study, Veblen, you study Ayers, you study, all these other, I know I'm blanking out on the names, but, Bill Duggar, and also Polanyi, right? So there's a lot of, good original institutionalist thoughts that we learn. And I think they're also very, very helpful for analysis sort of understanding of the U.S. capitalism or China's institutions, for example. There's Minsky for sure that we also study quite a bit at UMKC. But I would say that MMT is sort of, it's grounded on all these post-Keynesian institutionalism and Minskyan insights, although there are some different focuses, right? And there may be also difference in terms of some very specific nuances on, for example, money, right? Like, do people hold money because of uncertainty, or people hold money because of tax obligations regionally, and so on and so forth. So there are very healthy debates among these different schools of thoughts. But just in general, I think, MKC, or at least it used to be, I don't know now, I know that, Young Critical is no longer teaching there, and Randy is no longer teaching there, but they still have great professors there. So Matt Forstetter is still there. I think Eric Olson, also Scott Fulweiler, Linwood Tahi. So there's still a great group there that still carry on this tradition of teaching heterodox economics. Yeah. So I don't know what specific questions you have, but yeah, there are different, approaches. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Mike, what can you add? I know you've been around the block at UMKC, Mike. So what can you add to that question?
Yeah. So, Yan is exactly right. So the institutionalist school of thinking that is prominent as well at UMKC, they emphasize getting out from behind your desk as an economist and finding out what's going on in the world, rather than just assuming that like you're a physicist and there's these economic laws of the universe that hold at all times, at all places, and you from them deduce a testable hypothesis. And then you finally look at the real world, which means you get a data set from a website somewhere and you torture it with econometrics and statistics. Not saying that never yields anything useful. That's not, I won't entirely throw that out. But the institutionalists, instead of taking that sort of deductive approach, top down, let's start with theory, Descartes, start with theory, the mind, logic, and then work our way down to some sort of testable hypothesis and look at the real world. You start with the real world. You're a detective. You're a physician. There's a problem here and you're trying to figure out what's going on. What's the cause of the problem? So you start with the real world and you use inductive logic to work your way up to assembling principles like circular and cumulative causation from Gunnar Myrdal. So economics is more of a profession like medicine or law or something like that, rather than a science like physics. And you're asked to find out what the heck is going on in the real world. And then if you're going to build models or whatever, then they're more representative of what's going on. One of the famous founders of institutional economics, John Commons, was also by training a labor economist. And he was famous for telling his doctoral students, if you want to write in labor economics, your dissertation, the first thing you're going to do is work as a laborer. How in the heck are you going to possibly say anything about a laborer, what they do, unless you've done it? So take 3-4 months in the summer and do that. Now come and let's talk about, a dissertation topic, a research topic. So it's a very different way of doing economics. And I would argue when a non-economist, like the general public, thinks about, you study the economy, I think they would probably think, well, you look at the economy, right? Classicals don't. They have this edifice in their mind. It's this mathematical thing you got to learn. And then they torture numbers. And sort of the real world is like, well, it may or may not conform to my stuff here. But guess what? I got a journal article published.
Matthias just
muted,
melting away.
Either we're all deaf or he's muted.
Hold on. My dog has a thing around his neck, and he walks around, and it was dangling, so I muted myself. I have a question for Yan. I did this blog, I don't know, a couple months ago, and I was quite critical of what was giving a currency value. I was critical to the MMT view that it's taxes and government institutional fees that derive its value. I'm kind of in the middle. It is a component of demand for currency, but there's also, an individual's need to have something to exchange, to buy something. And you could actually, this was my opinion in the blog, that you could remove all government fees and taxes, and the government could just declare this is the unit of currency you must use. But that's it, and stay out of it. So very libertarian stuff there. That's another story. And that people would have demand for it because they need to exchange in the economy. What's your position on what gives a currency value? And I don't mean to put you on the spot, but when you mention that at UMKC, it sparks something in my brain. So what's your position on it?
Yeah, so I think from the MMT's perspective, money essentially is a unit of account, right? So just like you said, you wanted to exchange, but you need to denominate whatever that you exchanged with some kind of unit. So this is, I'm using 2 inches of something to exchange for, 3 pounds of something. So you gotta have to have a unit, right? So the money in the sense is basically a unit of account. But why do we come up with a unit of account, at least from historical origin, is that there are all these interpersonal obligations or debt. And so they're using the unit of account to record what you owe me and what I owe you. So sort of like, I don't know, you give me some firewood today, and so I knocked on the wood or clay or whatever, that I owe Ty a favor because he gave me some firewood today. So how do I deliver something back in return is I give you maybe, some food tomorrow, and then I could scratch it off, right? My debt is repaid. I redeemed my debt. So the unit of account, historically, right, thousands of, this is my favorite anthropologist, David Grebel, right, that talked about 5,000-year debt is, initially, this sort of unit of account is to record what you owe me and, what I owe you. And then this unit of account then becomes, just it doesn't have to be physically living somewhere. It could be just a mark on the clay. It could be just a notch on a piece of wood. So that is what really started this whole idea of we have this unit of account that record our debt, then we deliver something, or we simply scratch off that record to make the obligations, to meet the obligations. So then the question becomes, why the state is in here, right? Well, that's because the state wants your resources. And how do they do that? They impose certain debt on you, right? It could be a headcount tax. That's what Mosler likes to say, right? So your mere existence require you to pay a headcount tax to the government, right? And so that then started this whole idea of, is the government that prescribe what is a unit of account to record the debt. And then the government could also prescribe what can be used as a money thing, right? Denominated in that unit of account to pay for the debt. I mean, that's what Keynes wrote, that, the government, the state is able to dictate the unit of account and also order the money thing, the money proper, to be delivered as a debt settlement. So that is the whole story about, sort of the origin of money as a unit of account. And then later on, there are different money things that are denominated by this unit of account. And then people start to use them for their own private transactions. So money is never grow out of, higgling, haggling, or this kind of market exchanges, because that's not the way people live together. That's not the way, it's not based on the market transactions that, the tribal societies live together, or, how most of the history, in terms of, people's interactions is not based on that market exchanges. So that's why money cannot outgrow of that kinds of market transactions. But can money be used in market transactions? Absolutely. And you're right, once established, right, it can perpetuate itself. So this is a whole path dependency. The institutions like to talk about the cumulative causation, right? If today the US government announced, you guys don't need to pay tax at all, right? You don't have to hold US dollars anymore. But people will continue to use it because they found the usage of it, right? It can be used as a means of payment. It can be used as a means of exchanges. So people will continue to use it. But that does not explain the origin of it, nor does it explain who has the monopoly power, issuer, right, of these kinds of currencies. So that's kind of the story that MMTers wanted to tell.
And that's why you have godly tables in Minsky, because you got to keep track of the assets and liabilities, what you owe and what you own.
Yes, precisely. And I think that is also very important. I'm glad you brought up this, sort of sectoral balance, because there's a lot of confusions like what you said, right? They're thinking that, well, my household has to balance the book, so the government has to balance the book. But guess what? If the government balances the book, if the government is running a surplus, somebody else has to run the deficit, right? If the government is accumulating net assets, then somebody else would have to hold on debt. So that is a whole, very important. When you take the economy as a whole, you have to look at the different sectors. So I see on the chat people saying, the public debt is a debt to my children. But again, if the government is not running a debt, then who is going to run the debt in the economy, right? And I think at UMKC, we also talked about this sort of hypothetical, story, right? That, if one day your grandpa goes to you and open a chest and said, look, there are a lot of the US Treasury bonds in this chest. Are you going to cry because you said, oh, that means in the future I'm going to pay more debt? Or are you going to be happy because, this is my asset?
Oh, that's so great. Yeah, that's so good.
Right? So I think that just, not to mention a lot of these, public investments, if it's done right, it's going to help build the future. So there's the money side of it. There's also the real side of it. So we really need to think about public debt in a different way, right? Public debt is essentially private savings. Yeah.
So we have another Geopolitical question here. I might have lost it though. The chat has moved along. Oh, here we go. He asked this question to everybody. I love you, Joe. So we'll just ask it to Yan too. Tai, please ask Yan if Chinese CBDCs gives a financial advantage to China and the beginning of a universal advancement in finance. Can you elaborate on that?
This is a central bank digital currency. So, in China, it's very interesting. They start the whole cryptocurrency not from the private sector, but from the government sector. So at the very beginning, some of these big tech firms like Alibaba, like others, they are developing their cryptocurrency. But very quickly, the government says no. This is going to be a public thing, right? You private entities should not create these cryptocurrencies, and they actually crack down on Bitcoin mining, which I think is one of the best things the Chinese government has ever done. I mean, it's a little exaggerated, but I think that's great, right? You cannot imagine all the resources that are being wasted in mining Bitcoins, all the electricity uses, all these other environmental problems with mining Bitcoins. So the Chinese government simply cracked it down just a couple of years ago. And so now, you can't find private mining in China for these cryptocurrencies. So, this cryptocurrency is, again, it's not money. I mean, it's an asset. It's a monetary asset. It's a financial asset. People use it for speculation, right? It's or to make some payments under the table, not to be tracked by the government and so on and so forth. At least in the West, that's the case. But in China, the government simply said, no, we will not allow private sectors to run this kind of monetary scheme. So they essentially publicized and centralized the digital currencies. So when you ask, would that give financial advantage? Well, I think the benefit, right, at least for now, is it really helped to make the transactions more efficient, right? Make the money payments more efficient, and made some of the policy targets more transparent. So again, the government here sits at the center of the whole digital currency scheme. So the government has the ledger that really knows where the currency goes, where this digital currency goes, which is completely opposite of what happened in the United States or other countries, where the idea is that this Bitcoin is outside of the government's radar. But in China, the digital currency is on the government's ledger, right? So the benefits is, of course, it can help to really streamline the kind of financial services, right? You only need to download a digital wallet on your phone. You don't even need the internet. You'll be able to make payments and so on and so forth. And so it really economizes on all these fees that the financial institutions charge you. And it also in some ways it made the transactions much more quickly and frictionless and so on and so forth. There's also other claimed benefits which yet to be seen, which is this way we'll be able to evade the whole SWIFT system that is basically under the US's control. So this idea that if we could accept the digital payments not only within China but also abroad, then we don't need to use the banking messaging system that the US can control and could cut you out anytime they want, pretty much, right? Like Russia. So that was another sort of claimed benefit, which is from more of a geopolitical calculation, that if we're able to set up a parallel payment system, not relying on the US controlled financial payment system, then this would protect China from any sort of this kind of geopolitical risks.
Go ahead, Mike.
So when electrical companies notice a large spike in electricity use, they conclude one of three things is happening. Somebody has started to smelt aluminum, grow marijuana, or is mining Bitcoin. But the downside to central bank digital currencies, I think, or the fear anyway, they're not really well established yet, but is for civil libertarian concerns that the government could track all your purchases in principle, and if they don't like you doing something, they can shut you off or maybe limit you. You can only buy so much meat because if you eat too much of that stuff, it's not good for you. So you've used your allotment or for gasoline or whatever. And so you're cut off until next month. And we know what websites you're going to, stuff like that. So, obviously with law enforcement, they can wiretap and stuff, but you need a warrant and probable cause. So at least the discussion in the United States is there needs to be some sort of similar safeguards for privacy and what have you that would have to go along with the efficiency of a digital currency. But Yan is correct. I think there are large advantages to having such a financial system.
Go ahead.
I would tend to think that, and I really wish that instead of the all or nothing mentality, that this should be actually more of a libertarian question, an opt-in to say, if you want to participate in this, you sign up. And if your perception, your mental framework, right, if you view this as something threatening to your freedoms, then you don't have to sign up for it. But if you do want to do it, sign up for it, and allow that from the ground up. Let it be visible. Let family members talk about it inductively and share. Let it organically grow from the bottom. Like if you want any sort of large scale adoption, I think make it voluntary, and then brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles go, wow, this is the greatest thing to sign up for, right? I don't know. That's the way I think about how to adopt things into the market as opposed to rolling them out statewide. Yan, what are your thoughts on something like that?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with both what Mike was saying. I don't think this is just a digital currency issue. I mean, everything, all the tech that we're talking about these days, AI, big data, all of this involve this question about economics, sensibility or soundness of this kind of technologies versus, privacy, right? I mean, and I think on the chat, people were saying, well, you think you're not being tracked by the government, but guess what? You're tracked all over the place. You're tracked by these companies. They can easily sell your data to whoever they want. You are eventually you're tracked by, the government. Read this Harvard professor's book, Surveillance Capitalism, right? I mean, we're already under surveillance anyway. I mean, it's not like, if we don't use the digital currency, then we're off the hook. No, we're always being tracked, one way or the other. So either by the company or by the government, or eventually the government. If the government says this is like national security, you have to turn in your data. I mean, all the companies would have to do that, right? I mean, it's so funny that just a sidetrack. I was just recently read something about this one senator from Florida now saying that we're importing garlic from China, and that's a national security concern. I mean, garlic. Can you believe it? So anything can be national security concern, and anything could make you turn in your data if the government think that needs to be, right? So I don't think this is really a Chinese unique problem, and I don't think this is a digital currency unique problem. It's all versus the technology versus our privacy and our rights and whatnot. But then going to what Daniel was saying, yes, if you can have a democratic process, if this can be done in a voluntary way, I do think this is the best way. But at the same time, let's not forget, people don't necessarily have the perfect information, right? A lot of times people make choices that are eventually out of their own, that is conflicting with their own interests because they got bought into this idea, right? All this propaganda that you believe this is good for you, but it may not. I mean, this whole idea of consumer sovereignty, as John Galbraith have debunked a long time ago, 60s, right? It doesn't exist. We're not autonomous, right? All what we get, the information and everything, the so-called choices that we made, have some kind of larger forces behind. So I just, unfortunately, that's pretty gloomy.
Those of you who bought pet rocks in the 70s know this.
What is that? What is pet rocks?
Some guy got the idea to sell, he put a rock in a box and sold it as a pet rock, but the marketing was so compelling. Or they sell stars. You can buy a star.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole post-Second World War. That's a whole government's, scheme is to hire all these social psychologists to set up all these institutions and research institutes, try to how to hook up the consumers, right? That's a time when you have all this children furniture. They're smaller, so they need the small furniture, and you have to buy them. Otherwise, you're abusing your kids. All these other manufacturing consumer preferences.
Yeah, you didn't know you needed the widget until you saw the commercial at the Super Bowl, and suddenly you just got to have it. So the power of marketing, as Galbraith pointed out, is massive, and it's not a bunch of people throwing darts at a board. They use science, they use psychology and whatever.
Absolutely. So when you say you cannot make your kids take away their cell phone, I mean, don't blame them. They literally have all these genius engineers to design the programs that would keep you coming back. So,
my 3-year-old grandson yesterday wants to go to McDonald's, knows everything about McDonald's, the menu. Ronald McDonald, 3 years old. I mean, so kudos to McDonald's. They know what the hell they're doing.
I know. My second year, my younger son, when he was I think 4 years old or something, he started to say, "Mom, just reboot." I have no idea, what? His iPad died or something. He said, "Mom, it's easy, just reboot it." I'm like, where did you pick up those terminologies? I was just switch it on and off. He said reboot. I'm like, wow, that's cool.
Yeah.
So I had a good joke about garlic breath and national security about 5 minutes ago, but I lost it. So that's over with. So the final, what's that, Dan? What were you going to say?
I was going to say that's what those balloons were for from China. They're actually monitoring the increased levels of garlic on the North American continent, and so they can actually monitor how much elevation in garlic breath we actually have, and then strategically, I don't know what they do with that information, but there we go. Yeah.
I did have garlic bread at dinner last night, so
yeah, that's right.
So here's the final question. We've got to get Yan back, and so I'm hoping February. I know you're going to conference with another party to see if you can make that work. But did you enjoy the 2 hours?
Absolutely. I didn't.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't even realize it's been 2 hours, but this is great. Yeah. Thank you so much. I think I really enjoyed it. Yes.
Oh yeah, it was great. Yeah, there are times where I have to be on for the full 120 minutes just to prod the conversation along. But with you know your shit. Oh, Mike's cell phone's going off. So it was very easy for me to just turn off my camera and sit back and watch the show. So it's been really great. And another thing, and we've had these discussions in the past, there's just not enough like women voices in economics. So when we have a guest that's a woman come on the show and just take it away, it's really great to watch. And that's another reason why we need you to come back, because there's just not enough.
She knows
There
her
really is.
stuff.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Mike. I appreciate
You're
that.
good.
You have always been a mentor for me, right? That you are the one who's presented all your wonderful models in the stage, and so I really love the kinds of conversation, and yeah, I really enjoyed it. I think that when Ty said on Twitter or X that I'm here to teach, I was like, no, I'm not here to teach. Teaching sounds too one way, right? I'm not telling you stuff. I engage in conversation. I like your questions that prompt me to think. I like your criticism, to be careful with when you use supply and demand, So yeah, that has been really enjoyable. I really enjoy it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. So we're gonna have you back. We'll make that happen for our guests, because I can tell they like you in the comments. We've had guests where they've been told off. You haven't. So wow, that's rare in economics.
Oh,
No
thank
division.
you.
No division in economics. Wow. That is a wrap. We're already over 2 hours. Thank you, Mike, for being here again, buddy. You just donate your time every week, and I can't say how much I appreciate you being part of the show. Daniel, I'm glad you're back. I'm glad you're here with us, buddy. I missed you. Yan, this has been freaking awesome. We're gonna have you back. Oh yeah, hold on. I got to get the people on my couch. There we go.
All right. Well, your sound effect is terrific. The best one I've ever seen. So fancy.
That's not a
so
sound
great to
effect
meet you
yet.
finally,
That
Ty.
is not. Those are
That's
real
not a
people on
sound.
the couch. Those are real people on the couch.
Those are people. So I usually have.
Really?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. So I convinced my wife to leave every Friday night, and then I get a bunch of drunk people to stay over. And the condition that they get free beer, they cheer in the morning.
They did a great job.
And they always cheer in the same way. Exactly. It's really bizarre. They just do exactly the same thing.
Yeah, I thought it was bots, but yeah, that was great. But yeah, it's great to meet you. Not necessarily, not exactly the best way. I mean, not in person, but it's still good to really like picture you, and good to reconnect with Mike. And sorry for your loss, Danielle. I hanging there. I know how it felt. I also recently lost my mother, and that was, part of you is empty, but you gotta have to move on. So really sorry for your loss.
Thank you, Yan.
So Yan, stick around after the credits. We'll have a quick post-show chat. For everybody else, we will see you next week. Bye-bye, guys.
Bye.